And yes, I'm back. Same day. Talking about the interwar period and some of the different crises that were developing and conflicts between nations. And so how they were resolved. Today we're going to focus in specifically on the Ruhr crisis and just pay attention. Excuse me. Once again, the League of Nations attempts at keeping peace and early issues that were faced in the league. Of course, they handled many problems settling international disputes. And now, one of the things that we've seen and you saw with the Rapallo Treaty is the fact that many nations they decided to sign agreements that were independent of the league, so they would enter into these treaties amongst themselves, not necessarily as one of the provisions or recommendations of the league. All right. Some nations, I guess this sort of outlines the fact that they were not confident in the league's ability to maintain peace, and they did not want to necessarily support themselves militarily in all of the actions. All right, the General Conference. I did mention this in our last lecture, and basically this was organized by British Prime Minister Lloyd George, and once again, it was in an attempt to solve the problem of the Franco-German hostility. Of course, Germany was starting to default on her loans, and they even threatened to stop paying these reparations to France. And France wanted to really make sure that Germany was going to pay back the reparations. All right, and also the European war debts that were owed to the USA, and basically the League and others thought it was necessary to resume proper diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. All right. Now, during the General Conference, the French refused all compromise and they insisted on full reparations payments. So once again, France is taking that hardline approach, and they wanted Germany to pay. There were no ifs, ands, buts about it. No sort of compromise could be reached. Americans didn't attend. All right. The Russians withdrew, and that's when we sort of see the treaty between Russia and Soviet Union, and they signed that mutual agreement. All right. So the following year, the Germans refused to pay the amount that was due, and then French troops are going to be sent into the Ruhr region, and deadlock is going to quickly develop, and the Germans are going to respond with this campaign of called passive resistance, and we're going to look at that right now. All right. So let's give you a background to this whole Ruhr crisis. All right. Germany made first reparations payment in the end of 1921. All right, and later on, eventually the economy is going to start to suffer. All right, and Germany's not going to be able to afford all these reparations payments, so they're going to ask the Reparation Commission, which is a commission set up by the League, to ensure that payments are being made to grant them a moratorium, and that's just basically a postponement for a few months to suspend payment of the reparations payments that were due in January and February. So later on, in July, Germany is going to ask for a further suspension, and then they're going to go beyond that, to ask for a 4-year non-repayment period, and this was going to allow the Germans to sort of stabilize their currency so they can be in a better position to afford these payments. All right, and the economy is prospering. All right. Also, the German government's going to ask for a loan to help them repay this. Now, the French were suspicious because they knew about this Treaty of Rapallo and knew that the Germans had just negotiated this, and this was supposed to be some sort of economic cooperation between the two countries to help get them more economically sound or viable within the world market. All right. Now, the British said, okay, well, we can just lower the amount of payments to help you meet your financial obligation. We're not necessarily saying you got to pay every single thing. We can just lower the amount of the payments. Well, at the conference in Paris, the Reparations Commission, they sort of concluded that Germany deliberately defaulted on the coal deliveries it was supposed to make to France and Belgium. All right, and Raymond Poincaré, who's the French premier, or like the president, they wanted economic sanctions to be placed on Germany. But of course, Great Britain is like, hey, we're not going to get involved in this, and they sort of refused. All right. So French and Belgian troops, they moved into the Ruhr region, and they were going to seize these the German coal, steel, and manufactured goods as payment. All right. Now, of course, Germany had a reduced military. Their armaments were down, and they were in no position to necessarily fight back. So the chancellor, he sort of ordered a policy of what we call passive resistance. All right. And basically, they just did not cooperate. They didn't engage in any kind of military conflict, but they just didn't cooperate with the French authorities that had occupied this Ruhr region. All right. And so the German government actually offered strike payments to all Germans that stayed away from the mines, and they even supported the paramilitaries, which is not necessarily official military, to blow up mines. All right. Now the French forces, of course, they reacted harshly. They shot people, took hostages, and we see around 150,000 Germans were forced out of the Ruhr, and 132 were killed in clashes with the French police. All right. Eventually, the French are going to bring in their own workers, but they were not efficient. All right. By May 1923, the mines were producing only 1/3 of its 1922 levels. So the output from this rural region had actually fallen when the French brought in their workers. All right. Here you see this sort of form of passive resistance, and these are German gymnasts in the Ruhr region demonstrating about not supporting the French occupation of the Ruhr. All right. So just to give you a little background, January 1922, $1 bought 80 marks. A year later, after the occupation, a dollar was worth 18,000 marks. So we see this huge level of inflation. All right. By mid 1923, 4,420 billion marks were required in exchange for $1. Now, Gustav Stresemann was appointed the new chancellor, and he sort of called off this passive resistance. But of course, hyperinflation is going to continue. And there you see the the French soldiers occupying the Ruhr, and the civilians are sort of walking by, looking at them. All right, and just to give you a little visual representation of where we're talking about. All right, this is the French occupation right here, the Ruhr. All right, of course, this is demilitarized Rhineland, and there's Belgium. All right, so you kind of can see where exactly that was in Germany. All right. Now, the effects. The Germans, through their sort of passive resistance, they didn't really engage in it in the Ruhr, and of course, this hyperinflation that's going to ruin the economy. It sort of won the world's sympathy. All right, and this was also under the Anglo-American financial pressure, which we're talking about British and Americans. All right, U.S. All right, so a lot of people they sympathized the fact that Germany was going through this economic crisis, and that this whole idea of passive resistance, it was sort of a sign that they weren't going to engage in this conflict directly. Now, the occupation did much to boost sympathy for Germany. No action actually was taken by the League because it was legal under the Treaty of Versailles. Germany owed France reparation payments. All right. And eventually this is going to hit France, and France is going to have their own economic problems, and they're going to withdraw from the Ruhr, and they're going to accept this negotiation on the Dawes plan. All right. And basically, it was to break this deadlock between France and Germany, and the fact that Germany couldn't repay. And there was actually no reduction in the total amount Germany was expected to pay, but it was agreed that she would pay annually an amount that Germany could afford, reasonably afford, as the economy sort of developed and Germany became more prosperous. All right. So basically, we get a foreign loan from the U.S., 800 million gold marks, which was made to Germany, and this was to hopefully reboot the economy, promote industrial growth, and this would allow Germany to be able to repay France, and also the Allies to sort of receive their reparation payments also. All right, and as a result, France withdrew the troops from the Ruhr. Now the plan was successful. German economy did recover. All right, and internationally, the tension sort of decreased. All right, and here you see a diagram of this Dawes plan. You will see the U.S. Giving $2.5 billion in loans to Germany, who's going to make payments towards the Allies, and we see this big cycle of repayment and war debt payment. All right, so the money that's infused in the economy is supposed to reboot the industry and make the country more likely to pay back any debt. Now, the Young plan is going to be an extension of the Dawes plan, all right, because the Dawes plan did not necessarily have a total amount that's payable, all right. So the Young plan is sort of going to make that amount known, all right. So it's going to reduce the amount of reparations that's actually going to have to be paid, all right, and over a certain amount of time period. And so that's just generally, we'll look at this when we come to class. That's just generally the Dawes plan and the Ruhr crisis during this interwar period. Next up, we'll start talking about some other peace negotiations and settlements coming through this interwar period, specifically focusing on the Locarno Agreement. All right, so that'll do it.